Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising as we ponder one of the great works of human civilization, the very ancient Chinese text called The Secret of the Golden Flower. I would like to begin our meditation on this book by observing that one of the great consequential truths of our time. As you all know, through the State of the World Forum, we've been articulating four fundamental truths of our time. One is accelerating ecological collapse. The second one is instability and turbulence at every level of human affairs. The third one is the unleashing of exponential artificial intelligence. And the fourth is that we are experiencing on Earth technologically advanced non-human intelligence and sentient beings. It's the second of these consequential truths that I'd like to tease out as context for our deliberation today. It's an extraordinary thing that worldwide humans in society at virtually every level are suffering at every level of human affairs. And if one were to contemplate why this is so, one of the root causes is the dominance of Western civilization over the world. Over the last 500 years, the Western powers, both in Europe and in North America, have subjugated the rest of the planet and drawn the planet into an economic and political and financial system that has laid waste to the global ecology, that has decimated indigenous peoples worldwide, that has deconstructed societies that have endured for thousands of years and which have carried deep wisdom, and which has built an edifice that is literally consuming us, such that the violence of our economic system and the rapaciousness of our politics and our colonial sovereignty and suzerainty over the rest of the world has become normalized. It's been observed that since the Second World War, just 80 years ago, the United States alone has subverted or invaded or coercively manipulated over 100 countries around the world. We see it happening right now. The war in Ukraine, the genocide in Palestine, the turbulence in Asia, the invasion of Venezuela, all happening from the policy formations of the United States of America. And what we have to ponder at a very deep level, both at the existential level of our humanity, but also as members of Western civilization, is how and why are we doing this? Why is violence so endemic? And how has it become so normalized that we barely notice as history unfolds? And we seek to understand it in superficial ways, ideological ways, blaming one president or one country over another. But we don't get to the underlying causative formation of why this is so. my pathway to understanding why this is so and what we can do about it originated when I was at Cambridge many decades ago in the late 1970s. I was at Cambridge between 1975 and 1982. And one day I was at Heffer's bookstore and I was just perusing the shelves, and I had one of those experiences that we hear about and we all know about. A small book, The Secret of the Golden Flower, and I looked at the title and it literally jumped at me, and I literally seized it and I looked at it, and my whole body became alive with both curiosity and yearning. And I stood there in the bookstore reading The Secret of the Golden Flower. And I bought it and took it home and sat in my room and literally devoured it. And it completely changed my life. It gave me a meditative practice that I have continued and deepened and expanded and modified and enjoyed to the present day. And it introduced me to the man who became my mentor and, in fact, the framework for my PhD dissertation, Carl Jung. So today we want to ponder some of the complexities of the metaphysics of West and East. We want to look at the genius of Carl Jung. And we want to look at how a small text emanating out of the depth of primordial China, which was already ancient at the time of Confucius and Lao Tzu. In fact, the tradition is that it was the teacher of Lao Tzu who wrote the Tao Te Ching that formalized what became known as the secret of the golden flower. I had the great honor of meeting someone who's been one of the participants in Humanity Rising, Eve Jackson, who's been in touch with me and said that she was working on a book on the secret of the golden flower. So Eve and I have been in touch. She's a retired Jungian analyst, originally from Wales, now living in Crete. She's pondered deeply all the issues that I have laid out. So I would like to invite you, Eve, to turn on your video and join the conversation. And we're going to begin with just you sharing with us, Eve, how you encountered this great work. And then we'll just move into the various aspects of the conversation and hopefully end the conversation with some comments on how this great book can edify our lives and deepen our psycho-emotionality about the chaos that we're having to deal with in this world. But welcome. So talk to us about your journey into the secret of the golden flower.
Well, I came to it the other way round through Jung, um, or and it was, I mean, Jung's encounter with the book was a wow moment in the same way that yours was in Cambridge. It came to him at a point in his work for 15 years after the breakup with Freud. And because he'd lost his mentor, his father figure, and a lot of colleagues who sided with Freud, because Jung's psychology was going in a different direction and Freud wouldn't accept it. So Jung had then got thrown into a very deep psychological process of his own with images surging up from the unconscious and visions and dreams. And he thought he was going crazy. But he hung on and developed a way of working with all this material, of dialoguing with the figures that came up, recording everything in writing, and then doing drawings and paintings, and he found himself introducing these techniques to his patients, and so within his circle, these kind of psychological explorations became known and developed. But still, it was just quite a small circle of people. He gave talks and he gave seminars, but they were to people who were already, you know, in a certain circle. And then suddenly his friend, the German sinologist Richard Wilhelm, sent him this text, The Secret of the Golden Flower. And he said it was one of the most meaningful moments in his life, because he recognized in this text experiences that he'd been having himself and that he saw in the material that his patients brought. And it confirmed his theory of the collective unconscious, that there were people on the other side of the world who were having experiences that paralleled his own. And it brought him out of his experience of isolation, and what he found in it were images and symbols, particularly the issue of pairs of opposites, of yin-yang pairs of various kinds that had to be coordinated and worked together and brought together in various ways, and the image of the mandala, the circle with a square or cross that brought the opposites together, everything connected to the center, the image of unity, what Jung called the self, as opposed to the little ego, which is only a partial thing. And oddly, not long before he received this manuscript from Wilhelm, he had found himself drawing a mandala. He'd been doing that for years, and so had some of his patients, with a golden castle at the center. And he looked at this and he thought, this looks Chinese, but I don't know quite why it looks Chinese. And then he gets this manuscript from Wilhelm, and pretty much on the first page, it mentions the yellow castle. Mm-hmm. And this image recurs as a kind of mandala image during the text. So there was this very personal connection for Jung. And it also pointed him in a particular direction, because Wilhelm had mentioned to him that this was in some sense an alchemical text. Mm-hmm. And Wilhelm really didn't know much about alchemy. He thought of it as hocus pocus, more or less, but he knew that there was a Taoist alchemy tradition and it was connected to this text. And he also threw in his introduction to the text. I just find this a bit, there were people who worked with it, who practiced the practices of this text, who also claimed that it had an influence on the sympathetic nervous system and the hormone system. So those were just kind of in passing remarks from Wilhelm, but it gave Jung a nudge in terms of his future development to explore what alchemy was about more fully. And a few years later, he really started to get deeply into Western alchemical texts. And that his became really the main focus of his later work.
Let me just pause right there because I
Yeah.
want to, before we get into the alchemical process and so forth, I want to have you comment on the basic distinction that Jung makes uh, about the lack in the West of an overarching sense or metaphysic of wholeness. Because Jung also pondered, coming out of the carnage of the First World War and what was going on in Germany and so forth and so on, this extraordinary tendency toward violence in Western civilization. And his commentary was as impactful to me as it was because he very simply, but absolutely profoundly said that the Chinese symbol of the Tao, where you have the polarities, you have the opposites, but they're contained within a wholeness, the Tao, that keeps everything moving into their opposites, but in a flowing way. That in the West, there's no similar notion of the Tao, of wholeness. We have polarity, but we don't have a sense of wholeness. And of course, this is what Jung observed about Jesus, that he was perfect, but he was not whole. So, comment for our audience on your understanding of this insight of Jung's that really separates the East from the West in fundamental metaphysical ways.
Yes, well, Jung, although he was profoundly impressed by the Tao, um, also felt was very dubious about Westerners practicing these Eastern techniques because of this difference in the psyches. And what he recognized was the conflictual nature of the Western psyche.
Yes,
And his own experience of working was dealing with tremendous conflict. And out in the world outside, the First World War was going on. And he realized that what he was experiencing inwardly was not just something personal. It was about uh, the whole the world and the culture that he
mhm,
lived in.
mhm.
And his, of course, one of the great coinages of Jung, which has become common parlance now, is that of the shadow. And this is specifically comes out of the Western psyche and this development of a kind of consciousness that based on Christianity wants to identify with being good and denies the bad.
Exactly.
Uh, and so that gets repressed, but it builds up in the unconscious and it has to go somewhere. And so what happens is it gets projected outwards
Mhm.
and becomes a cause of conflict and war. So he saw in Taoism a profound uh, insight into a possible way of life, which, as you say, involves a flowing between the opposites, in which they kind of dance together rather than being split apart. But at the same time, he said that the Western psyche has to deal with the Western psyche, and it has to confront the shadow. So it's a different kind of process. There's a very interesting letter that Jung wrote in 1958 to a colleague in Germany, in which he describes a meeting with a Chinese philosopher called Hu Shi, and he's responding to a letter from this colleague which is making the same point that you've been making and that I would make, that there's something wonderful in the Chinese psyche, which has this, what he refers to as a totalistic view of things. Like we would use the word holistic now, I think. And Jung says, yes, but there's another side to this. And I had this conversation with this Chinese philosopher. We talked for 2 hours, and I put some, I just put a few straight questions to him, and he struggled to answer me because every time I asked him to bring me a blade of grass, he brought a whole meadow, and he was exhausted at the end of 2 hours. Um, so, and then he pointed out that because the Chinese had this, that this was the nature of their psyche, that everything was connected together, they were actually suckers now for all the gadgetry coming from the West and the fast cars and everything, like kiddies, because they weren't prepared for it. And what struck me reading this letter, which I came across a few years ago, was how underneath that conversation between those two men, one could feel also a dialogue between the left and right brains, according in the theory of Ian McGilchrist, which maybe I should just summarize. But based Ian McGilchrist is a psychiatrist and neuroscientist and philosopher, and his, I think, groundbreaking work is based on a huge amount of research done on people with only one cerebral hemisphere functioning, either because they've had a stroke or an accident, or experimentally because it's possible to, as it were, deactivate one side of the brain and to run tests on people when they're functioning with only one half of the brain. And what came out of this for McGilchrist was that these two hemispheres function largely independently, and they need to, because they have a kind of different worldview. And it's the right brain which sees everything in the bigger context, like the Chinese psyche, the Taoist psyche that we've been talking about, that sees everything, all the details as part of something bigger. Whereas the left brain, which is very necessary, deals with all the bits, takes things apart in order to control and
Exactly.
do its
Yes.
own thing with them. And it knows how to distinguish what to eat and what not to eat and so forth. But McGilchrist points out that the left brain needs to be the servant and the right brain the master, because otherwise we get lost in all these fantasies of being able to control everything.
Yeah, and
And
therein lies the tragedy of the West.
absolutely, absolutely. So now we do very much need. Of course, in the
Exactly.
meantime, this was nearly 70 years ago. In the meantime, the Chinese have caught up a lot on the technical side. The technical mastery, but they've still got a lot to teach us about the holistic view.
Let's thank you for that, Eve. Let's turn now to the different interpretive frameworks for the secret of the golden flower, because you have studied this very deeply, and there's been a range of interpretive frameworks in addition to Jung's and Wilhelm's, with Cleary and Needham and others, and you have your own interpretive framework. So just summarize these different approaches that some of these great thinkers have had as they've oriented themselves to this very obscure text that is really, if you've ever read it, everyone, it's not so easy to understand. You got to read it and read it and read it. And it kind of grows on you in very, very subtle and differentiated ways. But lay out, Eve, your appreciation for the spectrum here.
Well, as we've said for Jung, what Jung sees in the text is what he came to call the individuation process, which is becoming consciously what we truly are. And that process for him in his work involved working with the imagination. But then Thomas Cleary, writing in his book published 30 years after Jung's death in 1991, takes a completely different take on it. He's actually quite cross with Wilhelm and Jung for their interpretation. He seems to have difficulty in his own comments containing his disturbance at what he sees as a misrepresentation, because for him, and he translated quite a few Chinese texts. It is essentially, let me just read a little quote from him. The distinctive nature of the text represents a sudden enlightenment teaching, in contrast to the gradual teachings of ordinary Taoist works on spiritual alchemy. This identifies the Chan Buddhist influence behind the Taoist facade of the text. So he clearly was identified with the Chan Buddhist point of view, which is of course what became Zen in Japan, and the direct path to one's true nature by cutting right through all the images and the words. You just discard all of that. And so he saw Jung basically as a failed meditator who got bogged down in all these fantasies. But then in between, some years before Cleary's text, Joseph Needham got involved in the discussion, and he was a great sinologist and scientist who undertook a massive work called Science and Civilization in China, which continued over many, many volumes, involving his own work and various collaborators, many of them Chinese. And he was exploring the evolution of scientific discoveries in China. And what he saw was that the Chinese had discovered many, many things before we discovered them in the West, but somehow they didn't exploit them and develop them in the way that we had. And he wondered why. And I think to an extent we've already dealt with the why. But when Needham was studying these various sciences, he kept coming up against alchemy. Found that so many of these sciences seem to be tied up with alchemy. And he was a bit frustrated because, again, he wanted to disentangle them and see them as separate disciplines. And was it chemistry or metallurgy or medicine or pharmacology or technology? They all seem to be tied up with alchemy. So he started looking deeply into alchemy himself. And he points out that he'd also read Jung, but he points out that there's a difference between the Chinese alchemy and the Western alchemy. Both of them involve an exoteric and outer alchemy with in the laboratory with a flask and a furnace and combining and heating and so on, but also an esoteric, an inner alchemy, which is something that kind of separated itself out of the external work. And when Jung really got involved with Western alchemy, he understood, as some of the later 16th, 17th century alchemists themselves understood, that this was in some sense a psychological process, a psycho-spiritual process.
Right.
And the philosopher's stone was as much an inner goal as an outer goal, a kind of, ultimate reality again in which everything came together. But, says Needham, whereas Western inner alchemy was essentially a psycho-spiritual process, Chinese Taoist alchemy had to do with processes going on inside the body. It was a form of meditation, having to do with internal, as Needham saw it, biochemical processes in the body. He was a biochemist, you see. And for Needham, science was the great thing. And he saw the image he was fond of was that all of these scientific traditions led into the great one ocean of modern science, through which we would know about reality in an external way. So he understood that these alchemists, inner alchemists, had been discovering hormone activity, which was something that Wilhelm had touched on. And I'm sure he was right, but they're using a different kind of language, you see, because what this internal alchemy in the Chinese context is about is directing the attention inwards into the sensations of movement within the body and getting into that at a deeper and subtler level until what one experiences is the movement of energy within the body and the experience of the subtle body, the body as a field within the greater universal field. And if that sounds at all fanciful, then we need to realize that this has been discovered by us much later in a way of looking at things from the outside. So Einstein says what we've called matter is energy, whose vibration has been so lowered as to be perceptible to the senses. So there is no matter. And Max Planck, who started the whole quantum physics, said something very similar. He said, in all my life, I've never come across matter. So what these people have been discovering was that if you focus your consciousness into the body, you get down to that vibrational level. We can now measure the vibration in cells. And the cells are made up of molecules, which are made up of atoms, which are made up of subatomic particles, which are vibrating. So they were discovering that. And just to kind of conclude, of course, all of this stuff is very relevant, very much related to what we now know in terms of Tai Chi Chuan and Qigong. They're all very connected to this alchemy.
Well, I mean, that's at the heart of the text itself, is the circulation of the light, as it calls it,
Yes,
and the
yes,
circulation of the energy up and down the spine
yes, yes.
in various ways as the key to both enlightenment, but also physical and psycho-emotional well-being.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
I think what you're saying is absolutely at the heart of what the secret of the golden flower was all about.
Yes. Yes.
And as you
Yes.
circulate the light, the flower,
Yes. Yes.
the Kundalini rises and blossoms
Yes.
in your psychophysiology.
Yes. Yes. Absolutely. But of course, none of the others were wrong.
No, no, no,
Jung was
no. No, of
right in
course.
his own way. Cleary was right in his own way, and so was Needham, because it's all there in this framework where things are not seen as belonging in separate compartments, which is the left brain kind of view of reality.
Yeah, absolutely. And then to top it off, you have your own interpretive framework. So just take a few minutes to just describe how you're approaching this text that you've been pondering for so many years.
Well, only no. That's it. You see, I've the I come I relate to it from that energy point of view, because for years, for nearly as long as I engaged as I went into analysis, Jungian analysis originally, I've been practicing Tai Chi and Qigong. For 16 years, I had the privilege of working with a great Chinese master who had developed his own system. He never referred to alchemy. It was a different kind of practice, but it was very deeply related. So I have in fact been working for years in this energetic process, which um, just as if you're working with psyche in the Jungian model, you're allowing and listening to what comes spontaneously in the form of images and dreams.
Mhm.
So if you're tuning in through the senses or through your inner sensing, if you like, to what's going on in the body, so you have to open up and be receptive to what happens spontaneously, what is going on all the time, and interacts with your conscious need to regulate things. So it's so I experienced that as very, and as I say, I don't work myself with the text of The Secret of the Golden Flower. I've read it quite a few times in the different versions, um, but I kind of I came to it once through Jung, and then at some point it became more important to me again because of all this inner energy work that I've
Yeah.
been doing.
Well, let's pause there. I want to dive into this point, everyone, because this, to me, is someone who has pondered this text for nearly 50 years. I think it's important that we get to the heart of the heart. And I'd like to lay out my understanding, Eve, and then have you
Good.
comment, because I think the secret of the golden flower has a profundity that, again, the text itself often obscures because it's an alchemical text, because it is a highly metaphysical text, and knowing what Lao Tzu said as he opened up the Tao Te Ching, that the way that can be spoken is not the true way. So you're trying to describe a reality in which simply the use of words takes you away from the reality as you're trying to describe reality. But the essence, as I've come to understand it and practice it, is that because everything is energy, everything ultimately is light. And the key to health at a physical level, but illumination and alchemical individuation at a spiritual, shall we say, Jungian level, in the secret of the golden flower comes in a and through a practice where you literally circulate the light around what
Yeah.
it calls the heart in the center of conditions. So
Mm.
basically, the practice, as I've come to understand it, is that as you inhale, you bring the light down essentially from your pineal gland down your spine and then into the front of your abdomen and then circulate it as you inhale. And then as you exhale, you bring it back up your spine and circulate it the other way so that in your inhalations, you're bringing the light down. In your exhalations, you're bringing the light up, but you're always circulating it one way or the other. And you're holding in the very center the heart. And I think one of the most profound practices is aligning your breathing in and your breathing out with your heartbeat. And so that if the alignment of the heart as you sit in stillness, inhaling down and around and exhaling up and around, holding your heart as the center of your concentration, that's the key, as I understand it from the secret of the golden flower, which can be enhanced by not closing your eyes, but in, holding your eyes softly, as it says in the text, looking down your nose, the straight part of your nose, in an unfocused way while you're circulating the light. It's an extraordinarily powerful practice, which if you do it in a consistent way, harmonizes your body with your emotions and your sympathetic system with your parasympathetic system, because everything becomes aligned ultimately with the synergy between your heartbeat and the circulation of the light. So, what's your comment on that? That's my understanding of what it's saying at the
This is
level of practice.
Yep, yep. This is absolutely wonderful, Jim, because you've found your own way of working with it. It's not quite, how I mean, there are many different schools and different ways
Totally.
of practicing, and um, uh, within the Taoist tradition, and there's one. I mean, Taoist alchemy is still practiced, and I know of one particular school, one teacher who's now operating mainly in the West. His name is Wang Li-ping, and he's written a book, and his one of his student teachers has written several books, and they use this text at a certain stage in the work. But the circulation, what is called the microcosmic orbit, or the small celestial circulation, as I've been taught it and as I've come across it, usually involves bringing the energy with the in breath up the back, and then with the out breath going down the front. Because for a lot of people, and I can certainly see this isn't true of you, but if people have a lot of tension in the front of the body, bringing the energy up the front can aggravate that tension. It is circulated both ways, but what's normally taught as the main practice is, as I say, bringing the energy up the back and down the front. And then there's also what's called the macrocosmic orbit, where you bring that into relationship with all the other channels in the body, and including through the arms and legs. But I think it's wonderful that you've found your own interpretation and that it works, you see, because you've made a profound connection with the text. And it's spoken to you. And as I say, my own experience is obviously limited. But and I do know that there are many, you could probably talk to half a dozen practitioners who have worked with this text, and they would understand it somewhat differently.
Well,
And as I
that's the
say,
mark of a great book, that
yeah,
all roads lead to Rome. And it refracts and speaks to different people in different cultures at different times in history, all
oh,
in ways that are very specific to them. I mean, it's
yes,
like when you throw the coins of the I Ching.
mm,
It's this ancient book, and you throw the coins, and the hexagrams speak to you in a very, very powerful way. And Whether you believe in the I Ching or not, I mean, that's the mark of great
mm,
works of literature. They have an intelligence not our own, that have a capacity to speak to us very individually. So, I mean, you're right. In the Vedic tradition, for example, as you inhale, you bring it up, exhale, you bring it down.
mm.
And there's all kinds of different ways to do it. The key, I think,
There
is
are many different.
the practice in a way that works for you, which will change over time. My practice has changed many times, but the key is to practice. Like your
Uh,
study with this Chinese master for 16 years. The key is practice, practice, practice,
yes,
practice.
I mean, of course, it's wonderfully helpful to have an external teacher, but ultimately, the real teacher is the inner teacher, and
Yes,
that, when I'm talking
yes.
about what happens spontaneously, you can only discover that by practicing. And the Chinese teacher of my first Tai Chi teacher told her, "I can give you one leg of the chair. You have to find the other three yourself." I thought,
That's very, very true. That's very, very true. The master can only give you one leg. That's a good one. I hadn't heard that one. That's so profound, Eve. That's so profound. So let's as we begin to wrap this up, let's talk about your understanding as a Jungian analyst.
"Hmm,
Given what you know about the secret of the golden flower, what would you share with our Humanity Rising community that, in your view, would enhance their spiritual growth and development and the internal coherence that all of us need to be accumulating in a world of rising chaos? What's what's meaningful to you about the secret of the golden flower in terms of your own personal growth and development? Because you're writing a whole book on it,
oh,
so it's really seized you in a way.
yes, yes, but as I say, I don't use it as a basis for practice myself. I can touch certain elements in it and relate to them from that point of view. Um, but I think the question is also what we can learn from the Chinese psyche and Taoism as a whole, in terms of a more of our capacity to appreciate that we're part of an interconnected world, which we had been cut off from for so long. And I suppose one of the first things is we have to recognize our own limitations, and develop a kind of capacity for listening, and that's a listening to the unconscious psyche, or to what's happening in the body, or what's happening around us. I think it's become very difficult for us to do that, and this image that Jung used about of the blade of grass and the meadow. Interestingly, that same image has come up. Is used by Nora Bateson, the daughter of Gregory
Mm.
Bateson, who's a great systems theorist. And she teaches a technique for helping people to work in groups to sort of draw on the unconscious of the group and of the collective rather than the individual. And she talks about, we have to understand that the meadow is meadowing, that it's not a lot of individual blades of grass, that it's rolling and growing and meadowing all the time. So it's something to do with a shift of attention, I think, to that capacity to not be in a hurry to answer questions, and to deal directly with the details, and think that we can fix things, but to well, to listen inwardly and outwardly. And I think, you see, this is the essence of the Taoist tradition.
Exactly.
Is yeah.
See, and there I
So
would,
I
I think,
can't offer any technique. Yeah.
yeah, and there I would draw a little bit of a distinction between my own view and Jung's. I think Jung felt it was not possible or helpful for people in the West to embrace the metaphysic of the East. But I can just say, as someone who spent a lot of time in the East and studied Eastern metaphysics, to me, the West is lost unless it can embrace the metaphysic of the East. Just like you were saying
I,
about Ian McGilchrist, we're lost if we stay in the left brain. We have to embrace our right brain and let the right brain lead the left brain. And I think that's what's happening globally as the West sort of collapses on itself. There's a new metaphysic of unity that's rising. And I think it may be challenging for people in the West to embrace a metaphysic of unity, to embrace the Tao. But I think
mm.
that's the only pathway of our redemption.
Well, and I think all these interpreters of the secret of the golden flower were in some way working towards a greater unity, and they understood the text in that way. Um, and Jung, well, he said different things at different times, and at one point he said, after all, who would have expected that a sect from the Middle East would kind of take over Rome?
Yeah.
It
And then take over Europe.
yes, and transform the way people saw things. And he wondered whether the same thing might now be happening with the East. With
I think it is.
I think it is, but he also, he also felt maybe we're not ready yet. But that was, many years ago, and I think perhaps we are ready now. Perhaps we're
Yeah.
desperate enough.
Yeah. 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 Well, listen, Eve, thank you so much for your wisdom here, and I look forward to your book coming out. And as we conclude, is there any particular message you would like to leave our audience, both as an analyst and a deeply spiritual practitioner, for how we proceed in this chaotic time of ours?
I have no nugget to offer, Jim, but I think that it's not a coincidence that you um, um, born and living your formative years in China, and now in charge of Ubiquity University, whose main function, as far as I can see, is to develop along these Taoist lines, towards the interconnection of things, which we so badly need.
Thank you. Thank you. In my heart of hearts, I'm a Taoist. You're right. I worship the golden flower. Well, listen, thank you so much. Good luck with it all. And Eve will join the after chat, which you're all welcome to join. You'll see the link even in the chat box. You receive the link to the after chat in your Zoom reminder for today. And then we'll see everybody next Friday with another uh, session of Humanity Rising. Thank you so much, Eve. Deeply appreciate all of who you are and what you've brought to our learning community today.
Thank you so much, Jim.
Bye, everyone. See you next week.